RFK Jr. is continuing his crusade against vaccines. His latest move as Health and Human Services Secretary, canceling nearly $500 million in mRNA vaccine grants and contracts, dealing a blow to the research on the technology to fight the flu and COVID-19.
The health department says it will instead support other types of shots, such as whole virus vaccines. Kennedy has been a sharp critic of mRNA vaccines in the past, and he explained the decision about the shots yesterday on social media. Let's watch.
Let me be absolutely clear. HHS supports safe, effective vaccines for every American who wants them. That's why we're moving beyond the limitations of mRNA for respiratory viruses and investing in better solutions.
The vaccines were first used during the COVID-19 pandemic due to the ability to develop the shots within months and the capability to alter it based on virus changes. Infectious disease experts say the technology is safe, but the cancellation is the latest in a string of decisions surrounding Kennedy's vaccine skepticism. Kennedy has also pulled back a recommendation around the COVID shots and fired the panel that actually makes vaccine recommendations. It also comes after the secretary revoked a nearly $600 million contract with Moderna to help develop a bird flu vaccine. Some things that RFK does, I appreciate, right? I want my kid to eat less sugary stuff and not have the dyes in the food and all that stuff. But some things I'm like, okay, you are not an actual health expert, public health expert. And I know that some people feel very strongly about what the decisions that were made during the pandemic. But I mean, if the scientists are literally complaining, saying, this is a bad day for science. Like, what's the plan here? Undermining our ability, these are quotes, to counter future biological threats from scientists. Like, do you have a solution? I don't mind anything being replaced, but what are you replacing it with? Like, people should be vaccinated. It's been a consistent in our society on how we protect from viruses that are ancient history at this point, and stop them from coming back. And I just want to make sure that we're not just completely erasing that because of someone's personal feelings.
I think there are a lot of legitimate concerns about the mRNA vaccines, particularly as they were deployed during the COVID pandemic. Of course, there was a vaccine mandate for a lot of people, which led people who were very uncomfortable with the idea that these were issued under an emergency use authorization to have to go and get those or risk losing their job. If you were a federal employee, you would be kicked out of the government, the military. A lot of people lost their jobs due to that. And we only found out about some of the potential issues with the vaccines after people were getting them due to the mandate, such as issues with myocarditis in young men specifically, right, or women's menstrual cycles being affected, which I remember early on in the pandemic or early on in the vaccine schedule, we were told was a conspiracy theory. And then 3 months later, the New York Times wrote an article about it. So people were obviously have lost a lot of trust in the medical system. And they feel like, even to this day, probably not all that we should know about the mRNA vaccines and their potential side effects is known. And so I think it's actually the right thing to do to put a pause on funding this until we can determine if they really are safe and effective. And the effective question was another issue with the vaccines during COVID, right? We were initially told that this was going to stop you from getting the virus. It was going to stop you from spreading it to other people. It was going to keep everybody safe. Then we found out that it didn't stop you from getting it, and it didn't stop you from spreading it to other people. The benefit was really for people with multiple comorbidities, people who were in those higher age groups having a less severe form of the illness, but for the average person who was in relatively good health, really not that useful. So I appreciate that what RFK Jr. is bringing to HHS is really a rethinking of the traditional wisdom surrounding how we approach science and actually asking questions that the American people have about what they're being told to put in their bodies.
I think less than the message itself is the messenger. So RFK, knowing his history of kind of being like a denier of vaccines and some of the things that he said before he was in this position, kind of make me weary to say, and also people can grow and develop. He hasn't really changed his stances too much, to say that we want to make sure we're listening to science. And even though those experts that were in position, some of them still are from the time that we were responding to an emergency situation, COVID-19, which obviously had its flaws because we were dealing with an unprecedented in our lifetimes instance. So I think people should be given grace while Americans have the right to be upset about some of the repercussions. I think it was handled the best that it could given the circumstance. And I would like to give that to people that have protected us from things like allowing the flu to kill the masses. And, we've come to certain places in our time where we're not worried about things that our grandparents or our great grandparents were worried about killing them. These are just small things that we can get over in a week. And I think that that's important to remember. And not that we should pause funding forever, but we should just make sure that RFK is not just going knee-jerk reaction saying, well, I didn't like how COVID-19 was handled. I'm trying to satisfy everybody in MAGA or everybody from Joe Rogan down basically that's critical of all these shots that we were made to take. You can also accept that that was a mistake and that was something that now there should be more of a detailed conversation about whether people needed to take those, how actual effective they were, and not say we want to stop research and funding and stop paying for this because we always need more information.
I think people feel that it wasn't just scientists reacting to the best information they had at the time when they see people like Dr. Fauci in his emails instructing his subordinates to publicly bash the lab leak theory or to initially tell people that they shouldn't wear masks and then they should wear masks. And originally we were told that was because they didn't believe the masks were effective, but they were actually lying to us. The reason was that they didn't want to dry up mask supplies for key healthcare workers. And so when people are consistently being told half-truths or outright lies, that goes beyond just, well, we didn't have the full information, but they were actually trying to change Americans' behavior with not giving them the full information. So I think a lot of people really look at what happened during COVID and say, this wasn't a case of people just getting it wrong, but there was perhaps malicious intent here for them to try to push a certain policy and selling that to the American people by not giving them all of the information.
And I think it's important to remember that during that time, and whether this is not a perspective on whether I think telling people that it didn't come from a lab in China was right or wrong. I am indifferent about that conversation, but I understand that at the same time that we were trying to pass a Stop Asian Hate bill, and then telling people that this came from a lab in China, if that wasn't 100% verified, it would kind of turn the conversation into you people, othering people. And that was already happening as soon as President Trump said the theory. And so making sure to have all the information about that prior to just blurting it out loud. It's kind of like the same thing when President Trump said this accident in Washington, D.C. could be due to DEI. Like, that is such a problem because now we're not looking at the issue and we're focusing on something that may or may not be true. And then we create division based on the way people look. And so I think that maybe if that was the intention to avoid that, there should be a conversation about getting it right and not getting it first out to the American public.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big problems, though, with the immediate shutdown of that theory is that we were really late to get into Wuhan to be able to investigate the origins of the virus, which means we'll never have a 100% verified answer about what actually happened and being able to trace where that came from. And, a lot of people called Trump xenophobic when he shut down travel from China early in the pandemic, and it turned out he was right to do that. Obviously, we didn't prevent the virus from getting here entirely, but it did allow us to slow down the amount of people who were coming in potentially with positive COVID test. So that was huge. And also, I would say also on the Stop Asian Hate movement, that wasn't connected to people attacking Chinese people or Asian people because of concerns about COVID, but that was an issue with gang violence and street violence on New York subways. And didn't have, from my perspective, didn't have really anything to do with Trump talking about the origin of COVID.
Well, turning the temperature up for one group of people, it's the same thing like after 9/11, how Muslim people felt constantly as victimized. There has to be making sure that you would think that everyone has the discernment to not be mean to people based on something that may have happened in the country that they're from. But unfortunately, there are xenophobic people in this country, and social media exacerbates all of that. And so not to say that it wasn't accurate, before saying it out loud from the highest powers that be to the American public, the same way they do with all information they have, right? Intelligence communities have information, then they share it. What President Trump does often is share information earlier than it's confirmed, and then we have situations where people were just waiting to hear the answers. Now that that's actually a viable option, and I don't think it needed to take this long, he needed to make sure it was a viable option. I'm sure at the time they weren't 100% sure. Neither, like you said, that they are now. They haven't done the proper in-detail research to confirm it definitely came from a lab in Wuhan. But certainly at the beginning of a pandemic when everyone is scrambling, you remember that time when everyone was kind of listening to all direction and now they're upset they put all their trust in these systems that maybe failed them. Again, people were really scrambling and doing their best with a completely unprecedented situation. And I think that we should provide a little grace around that time and also not point fingers immediately like we shouldn't do in any disastrous situation. Find out the truth and then share it.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, there were intelligence assessments telling Trump that the lab theory could be true, and it was his COVID health advisory panel, that were the ones actually publicly contradicting the president when he said that, which led to a lot of this confusion. I think people appreciated that Trump was one of the few people who was willing to tell them the truth about that.
And people have been calling for people just to say things right away. That's one of the reasons why Trump is liked and won another election, is because he just says stuff. But sometimes, I think that there's more than one layer when you peel in the onion on how to communicate with the American public, especially when there's complete disarray and people were really panicked. We want to avoid panic, right? And avoid any lash out that may happen from the things that are coming from the highest powers. And so that's a tough thing to balance and a delicate subject. And it was on leaders, both Biden, Trump, and Fauci and everyone else, the COVID panel, to do the right thing. And so mistakes were made and they can continue to rehash it, but I don't think that the scientific community should pay forever and be taking away hundreds of millions of dollars in funding because of what may have happened during the last two administrations.
Yeah, we'll see if they're able to earn that trust back over time. We have a lot more to talk about on Rising. Stay with us.